Joining me now, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. He's a 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Called out President Trump in a speech yesterday for, quote, weaponizing hate. Senator, why did you feel the need to give that speech? What did you want to do with that speech?
Hey, first of all, I'm sorry, this is a little off script, but what you were just saying is one of the best expositions against this president, that he's hurting the people he promised to hate. I mean, it was brilliant, and I'm grateful for you laying it so plain. And my speech yesterday at Emanuel AME was a really important location to talk about what we're seeing in America right now, which is the fact that since 9/11, the majority of our terrorist attacks have been right-wing extremist groups. The majority of them have been white supremacist groups. And this violent white supremacy has been a part of our culture to the tune of killing thousands and thousands of people, beating folks, burning buildings, burning churches. This is a long history. In fact, Emanuel AME in generations ago was burnt to the ground, and when blacks were forbidden to gather and congregate. And so I wanted to talk directly to confront the Disneyland history that we often tell, where we actually diminish the greatness of this country when we don't speak to what we had to overcome to get to where we are. And right now we need that spirit more than ever to combat the ills of violence and white supremacy. You know, there's been this sort of strange, to me, a little bit mini news cycle about, is the president a racist or is he a white supremacist? And I'm not sure where you come down on that. And you're shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head? Well, I said in my speech yesterday, this impotent simplicity of asking who's racist or who's white supremacist, it is distracting from what the deep question is, which is, does racism and white supremacy exist? And if it does exist, then the question, most important question is, are you doing something about it or are you not? Because King said so eloquently that what we have to repent for in this day and age is not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. If racism exists in our society, it's not enough to say I'm not a racist. You must be anti-racist. You got to get off the sidelines, because if there's injustice in this country, it's a threat to all of us, and you must be an activist against it. And that's a much more constructive question. If this is an ill that exists in our society as an act of patriotism, what are you doing actively to deal with this crisis? The moral urgency here seems very clear, and it's been channeled by you and others, I think, in the face of what we've seen in the last week. I'm going to ask a political question that I don't want to seem glibly amoral, but because you are running for president, it's a, I think, important one. Do you worry that these sorts of questions about the sort of existential nature of America as a multiracial democracy and who is American, that the debate on those fundamentally end up playing on Trump's terms or putting the emphasis where he wants to put them and not on, say, the coal miners out of a job in Harlan, Kentucky, et cetera? Yeah, look, I am getting tired of political positioning and analysis, because I think it distracts from what Americans are upset about, that there's no larger sense of moral urgency. Let's worry less as a party about the politics and start talking to the people, talking to the hurt, addressing the challenges that we have. Trump is brilliant at trying to distract us, to make it all about Kim, what he said and what he's doing. Yeah, that's important, but let's not let us distract from, I think, the urgencies of coal miners, of people out in farm country, of people in inner cities who are just looking for leaders that will speak with plain moral clarity about the challenges and the issues that are going on, the larger systemic problems. It's why I criticize folks all the time to making this all about Donald Trump. And I know the number one polling issue in our party is who can beat Donald Trump. But I'm like, God, can't we have bigger aspirations than that? Beating Donald Trump should be the floor, but it's not the ceiling. It should be, gets us out of the valley, but it doesn't get us to the mountaintop, which is dealing with these trends, as you and I have talked about before, that have now been going on for a generation, that we have to address with more of a sense of moral urgency, moral clarity, and the kind of leaders that can inspire us to come together across the lines that often divide us to create real American change. And you'll find that we have a lot more when it comes to that. We have a lot more that we agree upon than that we disagree upon. Yeah, do you think that, I mean, there's sort of two schools of thought, I think, on the country, right? There's one that it's deeply structurally polarized, and you have to sort of understand that and see that in a clear-eyed sense. And we've seen that, you know, in the last midterms, where Dems picked up 40 seats in the House and they lost a bunch of Senate seats in conservative states. And then there's others, I think, who see that structural polarization as essentially a little bit of misleading. It sounds like you're in the second camp. I definitely am in the second camp. And you and I both know, if you talk through that political lens, a Republican, do you support Obamacare? Heck no.
Right.
Well, do you support making sure people have insurance even if they have a pre-existing condition? Yeah, well, I support that. Yeah. Do you support people staying on your health insurance till you're 20? When you start breaking it down, they support all the constituent parts. And that's because we see a Republican Party that's trying to hold on to power by doing everything from voter suppression to trying to tell these tired tropes to scare people away from what's in their best interest. And so the best leaders I've seen throughout our history are those who are able to cut through that to sort of spark a larger moral imagination amongst people that are outside of these lines. And that's why I keep telling people that we as Democrats shouldn't be just simply saying, okay, we're the end we want to is to beat Republicans. No, I think the bigger end we should talk to is about uniting Americans in the larger urgencies of justice in our country. And I think that kind of leader that can inspire that, or those kind of leaders, because this is not a one-person game, those kind of leaders are going to help us get back on track and deal with these issues.
All right, Senator Cory Booker, thank you very much for making time tonight.
Thank you very much.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.